The winter that nearly killed Annie Hart was the same winter she stopped being afraid of anything. She had come to the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1878 with a wagon, a mule named Gerald, $30 in a leather pouch stitched into the hem of her skirt, and a deed to 40 acres that her father had willed her when the consumption finally took him in a Kansas City boarding house. She was 24 years old, with dark hair the color of creek mud in shadow and gray eyes that people sometimes mistook for blue depending on the light and the mood she was carrying. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men in their tracks. She was beautiful in the way that a well-built fence is beautiful, strong and purposeful and clearly made to last. The 40 acres sat along a creek called Bitter Fork, 2 miles north of a town called Harlan's Crossing, which was itself barely more than a general store, a saloon, a livery, a small church with a broken bell, and the usual scattering of sun-bleached hopes that defined every raw settlement in that part of the territory. The previous owner of her land had tried to run cattle on it for 2 seasons, and had then given up, left a half-built cabin behind, and written off the whole venture as a lesson in humility. What he had not told her father, and what her father had not told her, was that the creek flooded every spring in a way that turned the bottomland into a soup of mud and lost opportunity. But Annie did not know this yet when she arrived, and so she looked out at the long grass and the scrub pine and the blue ridges of the mountains beyond, and felt something settle in her chest like a stone, finding the bottom of still water. She spent her first month finishing the cabin. She rechinked the gaps between the logs, laid new shakes on the roof where the old ones had warped and split, built a proper door with leather hinges, and dug a root cellar deep enough that it would stay cool through August. She was not a woman who had ever been given much help, and so she had become very good at not needing any. Her mother had died when Annie was 9, and her father, though not a cruel man, had been a distracted one, always chasing some next arrangement that never quite paid out. She had raised herself, more or less in the practical sense of the word, and she wore that self-reliance the way some women wore jewelry, not to show off, but because it was simply part of how she was put together. The town of Harlan's Crossing regarded her with the particular mixture of suspicion and grudging respect that small places reserve for women who do not behave the way small places expect. Ida Greer at the general store was kind enough. The Reverend's wife, a thin woman named Martha Coles, brought her a jar of apple butter in the first week, which Annie accepted with genuine gratitude. The men at the saloon, which was called the Yellow Dog and smelled of exactly what you would expect, tended to fall silent when she came in to buy whiskey for cleaning wounds, which she did once in October when she cut her hand badly on a wood saw. She paid for it, accepted their silence without flinching, and walked back to her wagon in a way that did not invite comment. It was Ida Greer who first mentioned Homer Ellsworth. "You'll want to meet him before the snow comes," Ida said, wrapping Annie's flour purchase in brown paper. "He runs the biggest cattle operation this side of the Laramie Range. Got good horses, too, if you're ever needing one. But more than that, he knows this land. Knows it the way some men know their own hands." She paused. "He lost his wife 2 years back, fever. He's been quiet since, but he's a decent man." Annie nodded and accepted this information the way she accepted most things, filed it away, neither dismissing it nor chasing it. She met Homer Ellsworth for the first time in November, which was not a planned meeting, but the kind that happens when a woman's wagon wheel breaks a spoke, in a frozen rut on a road that a man happens to be riding down. He came around a bend of bare cottonwoods on a roan horse that was built for work rather than show, and he pulled up when he saw her crouched in the road examining the damage with the expression of someone calculating the precise cost of a setback. He was 30 years old, tall in the way that comes from honest work and not affectation, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something that did not carve easily. His eyes were brown, the warm kind, the kind that did not slide past you but actually looked at what was there. He wore a sheepskin coat that had seen several winters and a hat that had been rained on so many times it had taken on the shape of the weather itself. "Broken spoke," she said without looking up, because she had heard his horse stop and she was not startled easily. "I can see that," he said. He dismounted in one clean motion. "Homer Ellsworth, Annie Hart." She stood and brushed the dust from her knees. "I don't suppose you carry spare spokes." "I don't," he said, "but I carry rope and enough sense to lash it well enough to get you to town." He looked at the wheel. "If you let me." She considered this. Not the offer, the offering. There was a difference, and she had learned to read it. Some men offered help the way they offered opinions, with the assumption that you needed it and wouldn't know what to do without them. Homer Ellsworth offered help the way he might hold a gate open practically, without making it a statement about anything other than the gate needing to be held. "All right," she said. He worked quickly and well, and they did not talk much while he worked, which she took as a sign of competence. Men who talked too much while working were usually working less than they were talking. When he had the wheel lashed and tested his work by pushing the wagon forward a few feet to see if it held, he straightened up and looked at her. "You're the woman who bought the picket place," he said. "I am." "Hard land," he said. It was not said with pity. It was said the way a man says that a trail is steep as information, not discouragement. "I know," she said. "I prefer hard things. They don't surprise you." He almost smiled. It did not quite reach the level of a smile, but it was the country cousin of one. "You heading to Greer's?" "Yes. I'm going that way. I'll ride alongside in case that lash slips." She drove and he rode beside her, and the conversation was sparse and comfortable, which was rarer than it should have been. He told her that the creek would flood in April if the snowpack was heavy, and that the east quarter of her land was higher ground and would stay dry. He told her the name of the man at the livery who would not cheat her, and the name of the one who would. He told her that the winter in this part of the territory came hard and stayed long and did not care about your plans. "That doesn't worry you?" he asked. "Coming here for your first winter alone on that place?" "No," she said simply. He looked at her sideways. "Why not?" She thought about it. The answer she gave was the honest one, not the brave-sounding one. "Because being worried about it won't change what it's going to do. I'd rather use the energy to prepare." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's a practical way to think about it. I'm a practical person." "I can see that," he said, and this time the almost smile made it all the way. They parted in front of Greer's store with a nod that felt like a handshake, solid and mutual. She watched him ride on, and then she went inside to buy her flour and her salt, and a new spoke from Ida, who happened to have one because Ida Greer was the kind of woman who kept things that other people did not think to keep. The winter came the way Homer had said it would, hard and without apology. The first real snow fell in late November and did not stop for 4 days. Annie had put up enough wood to see her through, had salted and stored enough food, had banked the cabin walls with extra earth and straw for insulation. Gerald the mule was stabled in the small barn she had finished building in October, fed and blanketed and thoroughly unimpressed with his circumstances, as mules tend to be. She had a good stove and enough lamp oil, and a stack of books she had carried from Kansas City because she believed in reading the way some people believe in prayer, as a thing that kept the essential parts of you from going dark. She was not comfortable, exactly. The cold was the kind that makes even a well-built cabin feel like a suggestion rather than a certainty. But she was managing. She was doing what she had always done, taking the thing in front of her and handling it. It was in January that the real test came. A blizzard moved in from the northwest on a Tuesday afternoon with no more warning than a shift in the air, and by evening the world outside Annie's door had been erased. The temperature dropped so fast that the nails in the cabin walls popped. She kept the stove burning through the night, feeding it wood in steady intervals. But by the second morning of the storm she realized that her woodpile, which she had thought was sufficient, had been more depleted than she realized, and the snow was so deep and the wind so violent that getting to the wood she had stacked further out was not possible without risking her life. She was not afraid. But she was calculating, and the calculation was not looking favorable. She had 3 days' worth of wood near the door. She rationed the stove carefully, wearing every piece of clothing she owned and wrapping herself in her 2 blankets and her bedroll. Gerald was all right. The barn was better insulated than it looked, and she had packed it deep with hay before the storm, so he was cold but not dangerously so. She checked on him twice a day, tunneling through the snow that had drifted against the barn door. On the 3rd day the wind broke, and by afternoon the sky had cleared to the violent blue that only follows a blizzard in the high country. The cold was still ferocious, but she could move. She dug out her woodpile, working steadily for 2 hours, and had just gotten the stove burning properly again when she heard the sound of horses. Homer Ellsworth came through the snow with 2 cowboys from his ranch, a man named Pete Dawson and a younger one called Collins, both of them bundled to the eyes and leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He had been checking on his neighbors since the storm broke. That was how he said it, matter-of-factly, the way a man says he was passing by when he was not passing by at all. She opened her door and looked at him standing in her yard in the snow, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, but something that ran underneath gratitude like a current runs underneath still water. "I figured you'd be all right," he said, which was the most honest compliment anyone had ever paid her. "I was all right," she said, "but that extra wood you've got on that horse would make me considerably more all right." He smiled properly this time, and she saw that it rearranged his whole face in a way that was worth seeing. That was the idea. Pete and Collins unloaded the supplies: wood, coffee, salt pork, dried beans, and a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, and stacked the wood against the wall while Homer brought a small bundle of oats for Gerald, who accepted this offering with the quiet dignity of an animal that had been expecting it all along. Annie made coffee on the stove, and the 4 of them stood in her small, warm cabin while the blue winter light came through the single window, and there was a brief, good silence that felt like the kind that only happens when people have survived the same weather. Pete Dawson was a talkative man by nature, and he filled the silence with stories of previous blizzards he had outlasted, each one growing slightly larger in the telling, and Collins laughed at the appropriate moments with the eagerness of a young man who admires the person he is riding with. Homer listened and occasionally corrected Pete's arithmetic on the snow depths, and Annie watched Homer while he was not watching her. She was not a woman who felt things slowly. She felt things completely or not at all, and she had learned to be careful about this, because feeling things completely in a world that moved as fast and as carelessly as the one she lived in could get you hurt in ways that wood saws and frozen wheels could not. But she looked at Homer Ellsworth standing in her cabin, drinking her coffee, having ridden through a brutal cold with supplies she had not asked for and would not have asked for, and she felt something that was entirely too complete for comfort. When they left, he paused at the door and looked back at her. "Storm could come back around," he said. "If you need anything, send word to my ranch. Any of my men will ride it." "I appreciate it," she said. He studied her for a moment with those warm brown eyes that did not slide past things. "You're not going to send word," he said. It was not a criticism, it was an observation. "Probably not," she admitted. "Thought so," he said, and he put his hat back on and walked out into the snow. She thought about him that evening, sitting by the stove with one of her books open but unread in her lap. She thought about the way he looked at things directly, without flinching or embellishing. She thought about the way he had said, "I figured you'd be all right," as a compliment and not a dismissal. She thought about his hands, which were a working man's hands, and about the way he had checked on Gerald with the same quiet care he had brought to everything else, and she set the book aside and stared at the fire and told herself firmly to be practical. Being practical lasted approximately 3 weeks. He came back in February, alone this time, on the pretense of trading information about the east quarter of her land, which he said adjoined his northwest fence line, and he wanted to make sure they had the boundaries right. This was a legitimate enough reason, and they rode the fence line together in coats and scarves, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, the snow squeaking under the horses' hooves. She had borrowed a horse from the livery, the one that would not cheat her, because Gerald, while a fine mule in every other respect, was not built for this kind of riding. Homer noticed the horse but did not comment on it beyond a brief approving look that said the right man at the livery had been consulted. They argued pleasantly about where the boundary should be marked, because the original stakes had been buried in the snow, and they argued with the kind of directness that both of them found refreshing. Annie had surveyed her deed carefully and knew the measurements. Homer knew the land itself, its actual shape rather than its paper description, and they negotiated between these two forms of knowing until they had arrived at something they both trusted. Afterward, he said, "I've got a pot of something approximating stew back at my ranch if you want to warm up before you ride back." She knew what she was being offered, and she knew it was more than stew, and she said yes because she had decided, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, that being practical had its limits. His ranch was 4 miles east of her land, a proper operation with a long, low house built of stone and timber, 2 large barns, a bunkhouse for his hands, corrals and stock pens, and the general organized industry of a place that had been built with intention. He employed 6 cowboys through the working season and kept 2 on through winter. Pete Dawson was one of them, and a quiet older man named Bell who fixed things and said almost nothing, which Annie respected enormously. The house inside was clean in the way a man's house is clean when the man cares about his space, but has no one to notice whether it is clean or not, functional and a little spare, but not neglected. There was a good stone fireplace in the main room and bookshelves that surprised her, because she had not quite expected bookshelves, and she stopped in front of them and read the spines, which included histories and a worn copy of Shakespeare and several volumes on land management and animal husbandry, and one novel that was so out of place among the others that it made her smile. "Dickens," she said. He looked over from the stove where he was reheating what turned out to be a beef stew that was considerably better than approximating. "My wife's," he said. It came out level and quiet, not with grief but with the particular careful tone of a man who has practiced saying something until he can say it without falling apart. "I'm sorry about your wife," Annie said. She said it simply, the way she said most things. "Thank you," he said. "She was a good woman. She died too young." He brought 2 bowls to the table. "Sit down, please." They ate, and the conversation moved in the way of 2 people who are finding that they have more to say to each other than either of them anticipated. He asked about Kansas City and she told him, not the polished version but the real one, about the boarding houses and her father's failed ventures, and the way she had spent her 20s becoming incrementally more capable and incrementally more alone. She was not asking for sympathy in the telling, she was just telling it, and he listened the way he did everything else, directly and without performing emotion he did not feel. He told her about coming to Wyoming 8 years before with his wife, Margaret, and 2 cowboys, and a herd of 200 head, and how the first 3 years had been the kind of hard that strips everything unnecessary away and leaves just the thing that is willing to survive. Margaret had been equal to all of it, he said. She had been a woman who made difficult things look achievable by simply refusing to treat them as otherwise. He said this with a warmth that was not painful to hear because it was so clearly admiration rather than longing, and Annie understood the difference. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Annie said. "I think she would have liked you," he said, and then he looked mildly surprised by his own frankness, the way people do when they say something true before they have decided whether to say it. She rode back to her land in the late afternoon with the winter light going orange and gold across the snow, and she thought that this was very dangerous territory she was walking into, and she was going to walk into it anyway, because she had not come to Wyoming to be safe. She had come to Wyoming to be real. Spring came to Bitter Fork Creek the way Homer had warned it would, with a violence that turned the bottomland into a shallow lake for 3 weeks while the snowmelt ran off the high slopes. Annie had moved her stored supplies to the higher shelves and had sandbagged the cabin door with filled burlap sacks she had prepared in advance, because Homer had told her exactly when and how it would happen, and she had believed him. The flooding was inconvenient but manageable. When it receded, it left behind a layer of silt that would, Homer told her when he came to check the damage, make that bottomland remarkably productive come summer. This was the other side of the flood's violence. It was not only destruction but renewal. "So the land's not as bad as people say," she told him, standing at the edge of the receded water. "Most things aren't as bad as people say," he said. "Or as easy. Usually something in between." She had been seeing him regularly by this point, not formally, and not with the sort of social structure that Harlan's Crossing would have put around it if they had been the kind of people who paid attention to social structure. They simply appeared at each other's places, with the regularity of people who had found that the world made slightly more sense when the other person was in it. He helped her with the spring planting in the East Quarter, which was the good soil he had told her about, and she helped him when a portion of his south fence line went down in a late spring storm, and he was 2 men short because Pete Dawson had gone to Cheyenne to visit his sister. It was hard work, and they did it side by side, and there was a particular pleasure in the way they worked together. Not the practiced smoothness of people who have divided labor by habit, but the satisfying discovery of 2 people who happen to think similarly about how a job should be done. She held the posts while he drove them, and he did not make a show of the fact that she was strong enough to hold them properly. She did not make a show of the fact that she noticed he was as methodical about the work as he was about everything else, checking each post before moving to the next, not cutting corners because it was cold and they were tired. The town of Harlan's Crossing had begun to notice them in the particular way that small towns notice things, which is to say that Ida Greer mentioned it warmly, and Martha Coles mentioned it less warmly, and the men at the Yellow Dog mentioned it the way men at saloons mention things, which Annie heard about second-hand and paid no attention to whatsoever. What she did pay attention to was a conversation she had with Homer one evening in April, sitting on the flat rock above her creek, while the last of the meltwater ran fast and cold below them. The sky was the kind of tender early spring blue that makes the air feel washed clean. She had brought coffee in a tin pot and poured it into 2 cups she carried in her coat pocket because she had learned that Homer could drink coffee at any hour without it affecting his sleep, which she found admirable. "Can I ask you something direct?" she said. "You generally do," he said, which was true. "What are we doing?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "And," he turned and looked at her. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said. "I've been trying to be careful about it, but I'm not doing a very good job." She took this in. The water ran below them. The blue sky was going soft at the edges toward evening. "Why are you trying to be careful?" she asked. "Because you're not an easy woman," he said. This was not an insult, and they both knew it. "You know what you are and you know what you want, and you don't compromise on either. That's not a complaint. But it means that getting this wrong would not be a small thing." She looked at him. "I'm not afraid of hard winters," she said. "That's what you've been watching me prove all season." "I know," he said. "So when I tell you I'm worth the risk of getting it right, you should believe me," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I'm not afraid of hard women." And the way he said it was so completely sincere that she had to look away for a moment at the water because something in her chest had done something she was not prepared for. "Good," she said when she had herself in hand. "Then we're both relieved." He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the rock, and they sat like that while the evening came down around them. And it was the simplest and most complete thing that had happened to Annie Hart in 24 years. The spring became summer, and the summer in Wyoming was short and brilliant, the way precious things tend to be. Annie's East Quarter came up with a crop of hay that made her properly proud, because she had worked the soil exactly right, and the flood silt had done what Homer said it would do. She had 4 kitchen garden beds along the south face of the cabin, and a small orchard of apple saplings she had planted from stock she ordered through Greer's store, which would not bear fruit for years, but which she planted anyway because she intended to be there for years. Homer came 3 or 4 evenings a week, and she went to his ranch at least twice a week, and the hands at his operation had absorbed this development with the equanimity of men who liked their employer and recognized that he seemed less like a man carrying something heavy than he had before. Pete Dawson had been back from Cheyenne since May and had appointed himself an unofficial cheerleader for the whole arrangement, which manifested as a habit of suddenly needing to do a chore in a different location whenever Homer and Annie needed to talk privately, done with a subtlety that fooled no one but was well-intentioned enough that they found it endearing rather than annoying. Belle, the quiet older hand, said nothing about it at all for 2 months, and then one morning said to Homer, while they were repairing a water trough, "She's a good one. Don't be slow about it," and then went back to what he was doing. Homer had told Annie this, and she had laughed, which was a good laugh, full and real and not held back. They were honest with each other in the way that neither of them had been able to be honest with many people, because most people do not want the unvarnished version of things. Annie told him about the ways she had failed in her first 20 years, the job in St. Louis she had left because the man she worked for had been the kind of man whose office door you wanted to keep open, the season she had spent in Denver that she did not talk about in detail, but the broad strokes of which she gave him, and which he received without judgment, and without the kind of studied neutrality that is its own form of judgment. He told her about the years after Margaret died, how he had run the ranch with the same competence as always and felt entirely hollow doing it, and how he had stopped reading Margaret's Dickens book, because every time he picked it up the grief came back in a wave, and he did not feel like he could afford grief and still manage a cattle operation. "Maybe you should read it now," Annie said. He looked at her. "Not to put her away," she said carefully, "but because she's not going anywhere and neither is grief, and keeping them in a separate room doesn't make either of them less true." He thought about this for several days, and then one evening when she arrived at his ranch, he was sitting at the table with the Dickens book open, and he looked up at her with the expression of a man who has done something difficult and found that it did not break him. She set down the basket she was carrying and put her hand briefly on his shoulder, and he put his hand over hers the same way he had on the flat rock above the creek, and nothing further needed to be said about it. It was July when things got complicated, which in the Wyoming Territory of 1878 was not surprising, because July was when the territory tended to remember that it was not yet entirely settled. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Cutter Walsh, which was not his given name but the only one he used, who came to Harlan's Crossing with 4 other men and took up residence at the Yellow Dog with an air of casual entitlement that suggested he had done this before and expected it to work out the same way this time. Walsh was a land broker, loosely speaking, of the kind that the territory had too many of in those years, men who had identified the gap between what the law said about land rights and what the law was currently able to enforce, and who made their living in that gap. He had identified several properties in the area around Harlan's Crossing as potentially valuable, particularly with the rumor of a railroad spur being considered through the valley, and he had come to acquire them by whatever means presented itself. Annie's 40 acres at Bitter Fork Creek was on his list. She learned this from Ida Greer, who had ears for everything that moved through the store, which was most things in Harlan's Crossing. Walsh had apparently been making quiet inquiries about who held the deeds on which properties and what the circumstances of each holder were, and the word widow, or woman alone, seemed to make him particularly interested, because such circumstances were often ones that could be pressured. Annie was not a widow and she was not pressured easily, but she was a woman alone on 40 acres with a deed that would need to be defended. She told Homer that evening. He listened without interrupting. Men like Walsh usually start with an offer, he said when she finished. Too low to be reasonable, high enough to seem like they're doing you a favor. When you refuse, things start happening. Fences get cut, livestock goes missing, water gets fouled. You've seen this before. In Texas, before I came north, a man named Grover worked the same play on 3 ranchers in a county east of San Antonio, took 2 of them out because they were already struggling. The third one had enough hands and enough stubbornness to hold on. He looked at her. You're stubborn enough. Yes, she said, but I don't have enough hands. You have mine, he said. And Pete's and Bell's and Collins's and 3 other men who are loyal enough and like their jobs enough that they'll back your claim if you need it. She shook her head slightly. It's my land, Homer. I don't want to solve it by borrowing your weight. It's not borrowing weight, he said. It's what neighbors do. They looked at each other across his kitchen table. The lamp between them made the light warm and close. There's another way to look at it, he said carefully. If you were willing, she waited. I've been trying to find the right time and the right words, he said, and I've concluded that neither of those things is coming by themselves and I should just say it. He looked directly at her. Marry me, Annie. Not to solve the Walsh problem. That's a reason, not the reason. The reason is that I have been happier this spring and summer than I have been in 2 years, and the only thing that's different is you, and I don't want to go back to the way it was before. The lamplight was steady between them. She had not been expecting it in this moment, and yet it did not surprise her, because nothing about Homer Ellsworth had ever surprised her, and she thought that was perhaps the best thing she could say about him. He was completely who he appeared to be, all the way down. I have conditions, she said. He almost smiled. I expected that. The 40 acres stays in my name. I manage it. You help when I ask, and I'll help you when you ask, but it's mine. That's not a condition, he said. That's just how it should be. Good, she said. Then yes. She did not say it softly or sentimentally. She said it the way she said everything important, directly and without decoration. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she felt that current again, the one that ran under the still water, and she let herself feel it completely this time without telling herself to be practical. They were married in August in the church with the broken bell, which the Reverend had finally repaired with a donation from Homer that summer. So the bell rang for the first time in 2 years when they walked out as husband and wife, and the sound of it went out across the flat sage in the Blue Mountains and faded somewhere up in the clear, warm air. Ida Greer cried in the way she cried at all the weddings she attended, which was thoroughly and without embarrassment. Pete Dawson shook Homer's hand for longer than was strictly necessary, and then hugged Annie before either of them had agreed to a hug. And Annie, who was not naturally a hugger, found that she did not mind. Bell shook both their hands once firmly, said good, and went a stand by the horses. Collins threw his hat in the air and then had to chase it across the yard because a wind had come up, which everyone agreed was a good omen. Martha Coles was polite and only marginally grudging about it, which was the best you could expect from Martha Coles, and the men from the Yellow Dog who attended, because this was a small town and everyone attended, were on their best behavior, possibly because Pete Dawson had had a quiet word with them beforehand. Cutter Walsh attended, which no one had exactly invited him to, and no one could exactly stop, and he stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands and the pleasant expression of a man who is making calculations. Annie noticed him and gave him a look that was not hostile and not frightened and not particularly welcoming, just the clear gray of her eyes saying that she saw him and was unimpressed by what she saw. He looked away first. 2 weeks after the wedding, Walsh made his offer on Annie's 40 acres. He came to the Ellsworth Ranch, which was where Annie was now living, in the late morning when the day was at its most respectable, and he was dressed neatly and spoke pleasantly and made his offer in the tone of a man conferring a benefit. Annie met him on the porch while Homer stood in the doorway behind her, and she listened to the offer without changing her expression. "That's about 40% of what the land is worth," she said when he finished. Walsh smiled. "Market's uncertain. A woman on her own on difficult land. "I'm not on my own," she said, "and it's not difficult land, it produces well. And I'm not interested in selling at any price that does not reflect its actual value, which at current rates would be considerably more than what you've offered." She looked at him evenly. "I'm also not interested in whatever comes after the offer if I refuse. I'll tell you plainly that I've already documented this visit with Ida Greer, who is Harlan's Crossing's best record keeper, and that my husband and his hands are prepared to be very attentive to the state of my fences, my water, and my livestock going forward. So if you're thinking about the next step, I'd think about it carefully." Walsh's pleasant expression had developed a slight strain. He looked past her at Homer, who was leaning against the doorframe with the absolute calm of a man who is not calm at all but has excellent control of himself. "Is this your wife's answer or yours?" Walsh asked. "My wife speaks for herself," Homer said, "and she said it well." Walsh put his hat back on. He said something about reconsidering when the market improved, which was the kind of thing men say when they are leaving ground they had expected to hold, and he rode back toward Harlan's Crossing. He left the territory 3 weeks later, after it became clear that the railroad spur, when it did come through, was going to go 10 miles south of the valley rather than through it, which made the land values considerably less interesting to his purposes. He took his 4 men with him and they rode south without ceremony, and the yellow dog was notably quieter, and the town notably less tense without them. Annie watched them go from the doorway of Greer's store, where she was buying seed for her fall planting, and felt the particular satisfaction of a threat that had dissolved not through confrontation but through simple persistence. "Glad to see the back of him," Ida Greer said. "So am I," Annie said, and went back to deciding between varieties of winter wheat. The autumn of 1878 came in like a painting, the aspens going gold on the high slopes, the sage going silver green, the sky doing its clearest blue above the whole of it. Annie split her time between her 40 acres at Bitter Fork Creek and the Ellsworth Ranch, managing both with the organizational thoroughness of a woman who had always been doing 2 things at once and was accustomed to the rhythm of it. She had kept her kitchen garden productive through August and September, and she put up enough preserved vegetables and fruit. The general store had carried peaches in from farther south in July to see them through a winter twice as long as last year's. Homer watched her with an expression that he did not always bother to conceal anymore, which was admiration, and she watched him when he was not watching her and felt something she had no better word for than home, which was a word she had not associated with any place or person until now. There were small difficulties, as there always are between 2 people who are both accustomed to running things their own way. They disagreed about the best route for a second trail between the Bitter Fork land and the ranch, a disagreement that lasted a week and produced 3 separate arguments that were thorough and productive, and concluded with a route that was better than either of their original proposals. They disagreed about whether to sell 3 of Homer's steers at the fall market in Laramie or wait for the spring price, which was a genuinely complex financial question, and they argued it with equal parts knowledge and stubbornness until they compromised on 2 steers in fall and 3 in spring, which turned out to be the right call when the spring prices came in strong. They did not disagree about the large things, because the large things, how to treat people, how to work, what to do with hardship when it arrived, they already agreed on without having had to negotiate it, which was the real bedrock of them. Pete Dawson noticed that Annie had brought books from her cabin to the ranch house shelves, where they now lived alongside Homer's histories and the animal husbandry volumes and Margaret's Dickens, and that Homer was reading in the evenings again, rather than just sitting by the fire with the look of a man who was not sure what to do with the quiet. Pete did not comment on this, because Pete was perceptive enough to recognize that some things got better when you left them alone. Winter came again, and this time Annie was ready for it the way a woman is ready for something she has survived before and understood. The woodpile was massive, Homer, and his hands had cut wood through August and September until the stacks were taller than the barn wall. The root cellar was full. Gerald the mule had been brought to the large barn at the ranch, where he established an unexpectedly cordial relationship with Homer's 3 horses, and the single bad-tempered mule that Homer kept for the same reasons one keeps difficult things that are nevertheless excellent at their jobs. The first blizzard of December hit hard, but Annie and Homer were in the ranch house together when it arrived, and she felt the difference between surviving hard weather alone and surviving it with someone beside you. Not that she had been diminished by the solitude, or that she needed the company to manage. But there was something in having someone else's voice in the house when the wind hit the walls, in splitting the watch on the fire through the night so each of them could sleep, in waking to a face that was glad to see you when the cold was pressing in from all directions. There was something in that which went beyond practicality and into the deeper reasons that people find each other in the first place. She was in December when she first suspected, and she was sure by January. She told Homer on a clear, cold morning when the sun was white on the snow, and the ice in the window corners made the glass look like it was growing crystals. He was at the stove and she was sitting at the table, and she said, "I think we're going to have a child in the summer," in the same tone she used for practical information, because that was how she delivered everything she felt most deeply directly and without the performance of emotion, trusting the person she was talking to understand that the directness was not distance. He turned from the stove and looked at her, and his face did something complicated, and then settled into something that she could only describe as a man who has been handed something he did not know how much he had wanted until it was in his hands. He came to the table and sat down across from her, and he took both her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I'm entirely well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, which I understand is the usual arrangement, otherwise fine." "A summer baby," he said almost to himself. "Late July if my accounting is right." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been thinking about something for a while," he said. "About the house, about whether you might want more rooms." "You want to build on," she said. "I want to build whatever you want," he said. "It's your house now, too." She thought about it. "I want a larger kitchen," she said. "And a room with good south light that I can use for sewing and reading and whatever else needs good light." "All right," he said. "And a room for the baby, obviously." "Obviously," he said, and the expression on his face was the one she was still learning, the one that meant he was feeling something large and was not quite sure of its borders yet. They planned the addition through the winter, drawing it out on paper in the evenings by lamplight, revising it, arguing pleasantly about the window placement and the floor plan, arriving at something that was better than the original house and better than either of their separate ideas, the way their things tended to go when they worked on them together. The spring came, and the building began. Homer and his hands worked on it in the hours that could be spared from the seasonal cattle work, and Annie contributed to the planning, and the interior finish work with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Pete Dawson, who turned out to have a particular talent for carpentry, built the kitchen shelves and the frames for the windows in the new room, and Collins and Bell did the heavy framing work under Homer's direction. The addition was done by June, solid and good, with the large kitchen Annie had asked for, and the south-facing room that caught the afternoon light exactly the way she had wanted, and a nursery built off the main bedroom that Homer had lined with good pine boards that smelled clean and sweet. Annie's apple saplings at Bitter Fork Creek had survived their second winter and were showing good healthy growth, which pleased her enormously. She had hired a young man from town, named Davis, to tend the Bitter Fork land through the summer months, because she was not going to abandon it, and she was also not in a condition to ride out and work it as she had before. And Davis was a reliable 17-year-old who needed the work, and was old enough to handle the responsibility, but young enough to still take instruction without taking it as an insult to his dignity. July came in hot and dry, which was unusual for that part of the territory, and the days were long and the nights were warm, and Annie moved through the final weeks of her pregnancy with the same practical efficiency she moved through everything, not pretending it was easier than it was, not making it more dramatic than it needed to be, simply managing. The baby came on the 23rd of July, a Tuesday, helped into the world by a woman named Clara Hutchins, who served as Harlan's Crossing's midwife, and had delivered more babies in this territory than she could accurately count. Homer stayed in the house because Annie told him he could, which Clara noted was unusual, and which Homer used as an opportunity to be as useful as possible and out of the way at the same time, which was its own form of skill. It was a boy. He was red-faced and loud about it, which Clara said was a good sign, and he had Annie's gray eyes and Homer's jaw, which was perhaps the most accurate prediction of his character they would have for some years. Annie held him for the first time with the expression of a woman who has encountered something entirely outside her previous experience, and is deciding, clearly and immediately, that she is fully committed to it. Homer sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his son, and his face did the complicated thing again and did not settle, just stayed that way, complicated and full, and Annie looked at him looking at the baby and felt something that she could not have described to anyone who had not felt it themselves, which was the particular completeness of being exactly where you are supposed to be. "What do we call him?" Homer asked. She had thought about this. "William," she said, "after my father." She paused. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," he said. "William Ellsworth." "William Hart Ellsworth," she said. He looked at her. "He should carry both," she said. Homer nodded slowly. "William Hart Ellsworth," he said, testing it. "That's a good name." William Hart Ellsworth proceeded to be a substantial presence in the world from his first day, which was consistent with his parentage. He ate well and slept reasonably, and greeted the world with the combination of alertness and stubbornness that everyone who knew his parents found entirely predictable. Gerald the mule, upon being introduced to the baby in the doorway of the barn when William was 3 weeks old, regarded him with the measured assessment of an animal that has seen everything and is willing to reserve judgment. The autumn brought the harvest and the quiet settling in that follows a summer of building and change. Annie's Bitter Fork land had had its best season yet. The hay cut was strong, and the kitchen garden at the main ranch had produced abundantly, and the orchard saplings were another year closer to bearing, which was a satisfaction that required patience and was therefore the best kind. Ida Greer came to see the baby and brought a quilt she had made herself, which Annie received with genuine warmth and hung in the nursery window as a curtain, because the pattern of it was too good to lay on a floor. Martha Coles came and was softer about it than she had been about anything else, because Martha Coles, whatever her limitations, loved children unreservedly, and William was the kind of baby who converted people by simply existing. Pete Dawson arrived with a carved wooden horse he had made in his free evenings, smooth and fine, better than anyone who knew Pete mostly as a cowboy would have expected, and Annie set it on the nursery shelf where William could see it from his cradle. Bell said nothing for 2 weeks and then appeared at the door one evening with a jar of his own honey. He kept bees, which no one had known until this moment, and handed it over with the single word for the boy, and walked back to the bunkhouse. Homer and Annie looked at each other over the jar of honey and did not say anything, but they were both smiling. The second winter, with William in the house, was different from the winters that had come before in the way that all things are different when there is a child in them. It was louder and warmer in every sense, and it required a kind of constant attention that Annie adapted to with the thoroughness she adapted to every practical challenge, and Homer adapted to with the combination of steadiness and capacity for delight that she had come to regard as his essential nature. William was a winter baby who regarded winter with indifference, which they both found encouraging. He slept through blizzards and regarded frost on the windows with the focused interest of a person who is working something out, and by the time he was 4 months old, he had clearly decided that the world was interesting, and he intended to engage with it fully as soon as the logistics allowed. On a night in November when the snow was coming steady outside and William was asleep in his nursery, and the fire was good in the main room, Annie sat with Homer in the chairs by the fire that she had pulled slightly closer together than they had been when they were his chairs alone, and she read and he read, and the house made the small sounds that good houses make when the weather is outside where it belongs. She lowered her book and looked at him. He looked up. "I told you I wasn't afraid of hard winters," she said. He set his book on his knee. "You did, and you said you weren't afraid of hard women." "Also true," he said. "I think we were both right," she said. He looked at her with the warm brown eyes that had always looked at her directly, that had never slid past her, and he said, "I think we were both very right," and reached over and took her hand the way he always did, the current running underneath, the still water above it, everything exactly as it was supposed to be. The winter deepened and held, and then, as it always did, broke. Spring came to Bitter Fork Creek in 1880, the way spring always came to that part of the Wyoming Territory, with a great rushing energy, the snowmelt running fast in the creek, the aspens on the high slopes leafing out in their particular brilliant green, the sage filling the air with its clean, sharp smell when the afternoon warmed enough to draw it out. The apple saplings at Annie's 40 acres were in their third year, and beginning to show the thickening of their trunks that meant they were establishing themselves properly, growing downward before they grew outward, sending roots into the ground the way things that intend to last must do. William Hart Ellsworth was 8 months old, and had recently discovered that he could sit upright unsupported, which he regarded as a significant personal achievement and demonstrated constantly. He had also developed a particular attachment to Gerald the mule that expressed itself as a focused attention, whenever Gerald was in view, and a reaching of both hands in Gerald's direction that Gerald received with the dignity of an animal that has decided to be patient about the small creatures that seem to be proliferating around him. Annie rode out to Bitter Fork Creek in the early spring mornings, while Homer watched William, and the day was still cool and the light was long and golden, and she walked the land that was hers, checking the apple trees, noting where the flood had spread this year and where the silt had come down, planning the season's plantings with Davis, who was now 18 and had grown into the work with a seriousness that she had come to rely on. He was the kind of young man who asked good questions and listened to the answers, which was rarer than it should have been. She had been thinking about the future of the Bitter Fork land, what it would become over the years, what it could be built into, and she had been talking to Homer about it in the evenings with increasing specificity. The hay production was reliable. The kitchen garden at the ranch was more than adequate for their needs. What she wanted to do with Bitter Fork, she thought, was the orchard. Not just the apple trees already planted, but a proper orchard, fenced and managed, expanded over the years until it was producing enough to sell at the Laramie market in quantity. "Fruit is scarce here," she said. "People pay well for it. And it's not a gamble the way cattle can be bad whether it takes a season's crop, but it doesn't take the trees themselves, usually. You build it for years, not seasons." Homer listened and thought about it and said that it was a good idea, and more than that, it was her idea, which meant it was going to happen whether or not he thought it was good, which he meant entirely affectionately and which was entirely true. They planted 12 more apple trees that spring, bought from a nursery in Cheyenne that Annie had written to the previous autumn, and 6 pear trees, and 2 cherry trees that Homer was skeptical of, but Annie was optimistic about. The cherry trees turned out to be the hardiest of all, which neither of them had predicted, and which Annie noted with satisfaction, and Homer acknowledged with the grace of a man who had been wrong about something, and was genuinely fine with it. The summer of 1880 was the summer that Harlan's Crossing began to grow in earnest. The railroad spur that had come 10 miles south the previous year had brought enough traffic to the region that the town was expanding. A new doctor arrived in June, a man named Walter Hames, who was young and serious and very good. which Annie confirmed by the thorough way he examined William at the first opportunity and gave sensible, unsentimental advice about the baby's health and development. A second general store opened, which Ida Greer regarded with the competitive spirit of a woman who had been the only such establishment in town for years and had no intention of losing the title of best, and promptly reorganized and expanded her stock in ways that made her right. A schoolhouse was proposed and the foundation laid by July, which pleased Annie deeply. She had been thinking about this, about the kind of place Harlan's Crossing was becoming, about whether it would become the kind of place that took the education of its children seriously. She contributed to the schoolhouse fund generously and attended every planning meeting, where she was the woman who asked the most specific and useful questions, and whose proposals tended to get incorporated into the final plan whether they were attributed to her or not, which was fine with her as long as they were incorporated. William took his first steps in September, to the considerable enthusiasm of the assembled household, which at that particular moment included Homer, Annie, Pete Dawson, Belle, and Ida Greer, who had come to deliver a special order of fabric and happened to witness history. He walked 3 steps, sat down hard, looked at the floor with the expression of a person conducting an inquiry, and then got up and walked 4 steps, which seemed to him like a more satisfactory result. "Stubborn," Pete Dawson said admiringly. "He comes by it naturally," said Ida Greer, looking at Annie. "From both sides," said Homer, which Annie thought was entirely fair. The autumn roundup of 1880 was Homer's best since coming to Wyoming. The herd was strong and the prices in Laramie were good, and he came back from the fall drive with enough to put away against a hard year, and enough to invest in the expanded orchard project at Bitter Fork. He sat at the kitchen table with Annie that evening with the account books between them, and they went through the numbers together the way they went through everything completely and honestly, neither of them pretending the numbers said something they did not say, neither of them dramatizing them either. "We could hire a second hand at Bitter Fork," Annie said. "Davis is good, but he's one person, and as the orchard expands he'll need help." "Agreed," Homer said. "Davis would know who in town is worth considering." "He would," she said. "I'll ask him." This was how they operated, not one of them deciding and the other assenting, but both of them contributing the piece of the picture they saw most clearly, and the whole being better than either part. It was not always easy. Annie had opinions that she held firmly, and Homer had a stubbornness of his own that expressed itself quietly, but did not give ground easily on matters of principle. There were days when the friction between 2 strong-willed people in close proximity produced actual heat, when words were said that required apology afterward, when the apology was made with the same directness as everything else they said to each other and was accepted the same way. But the foundation held. It held because it had been built on honest materials, not on the performance of something, not on the version of themselves they wanted each other to see, but on the actual thing, tested through blizzards and land disputes, and a first year of marriage and a baby, and the daily specific work of building something out of the high plains and the rocky soil, and the hard winters that came every year without apology. On a December evening of 1880, with William asleep in his nursery and the fire good in the main room and the second winter blizzard of the season sending snow against the windows in the particular muffled way of serious snow that knows it has time, Homer put down his book and said, "Are you happy, Annie?" She looked up from her own book. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was her way with everything. "Yes," she said. "I am." She looked at him. "Are you?" "More than I have words for," he said simply. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers, and they stayed that way while the fire talked to itself, and the snow came down outside, and William slept through it all in the other room, the way their son slept through everything, with the confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt that the world was safe and warm and would be there when he woke up. The years that followed ran in the way of good years, which is not without hardship. Good years in the Wyoming Territory were never without hardship, but with a through line of purpose and warmth that made the hardship something to be managed rather than something to be survived. The apple trees at Bitter Fork Creek bore their first real crop in 1882, modest but genuine, and Annie sold 3 bushels at the Laramie market in October and came home with enough money to plant 4 more trees, which she did. By 1883, the orchard was producing well enough to be called a business, and the name Hart Orchard, which she had used on the label of the preserves she had begun putting up and selling through Greer's store, was known in the area as a mark of quality. Homer had extended his cattle operation north and employed 8 hands through the working season now, and the ranch had taken on the look of a place that had found its proper scale, not grand, not modest, just exactly what it needed to be. William Hart Ellsworth at 4 years old was exactly what his parentage promised: determined, curious, direct, and loud about his opinions in the way of a child who has never been taught that opinions should be softened before delivery. Homer was working on the softening piece with gentle persistence. Annie was working on the opinions themselves, teaching him, as she had been taught by necessity and as she had taught herself, to test an opinion against evidence before holding it too hard. The schoolhouse in Harlan's Crossing had been open for 2 years and was presided over by a teacher named Miss Alois Farr, who had come from Ohio and was the kind of woman who wore her competence like a second coat. You noticed it immediately, and it did not come off. Annie had liked her from the first meeting, and they had become friendly in the way of 2 women who respect each other's ability to get things done. There was a Sunday in the spring of 1883 when Annie stood at the edge of the Bitter Fork Creek orchard in the late morning, the apple trees in bloom around her, the white flowers against the blue sky, the smell of them coming on the warm air. And she thought about the woman who had arrived here 5 years before with a broken wagon wheel and $30 in her hem, and the particular kind of stubbornness that had not yet been given anything worth putting it toward. She thought about the flat rock above the creek where she had told Homer she was not afraid of hard winters, and where he had told her he was not afraid of hard women, and where they had both been relieved, and where everything that came after had truly started, not in the dramatic way of stories but in the way of real things, which is to say quietly and with the full weight of truth behind it. She heard hooves on the trail and turned to see Homer riding toward the orchard with William in the saddle in front of him, which was William's current favorite arrangement for any journey longer than walking distance. And the boy was pointing at the apple trees in bloom with the focused enthusiasm of a 4-year-old who knows that trees with flowers become trees with apples, and apples are important. Homer pulled up at the orchard fence and lifted William down, and the boy ran immediately toward the trees the way he ran at everything, without hesitation, full speed, convinced of his welcome. Homer dismounted and came to stand beside Annie, and they watched William wade into the orchard grass with his arms out, walking between the rows of blooming trees with the expression of a person conducting a tour of his own kingdom. "Greer's been asking if you'll expand the preserve line," Homer said. "She says she could sell twice what you make." "I know," Annie said. "I'm thinking about it." "I know you are," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, which she did sometimes when the moment called for it, and she was not thinking about whether she was a person who leaned against people's shoulders, because she had stopped thinking about that some time ago. He put his arm around her. "The pear trees are going to be good this year," she said. "I know," he said. "The cherries too." "You were right about the cherries," he said. "I was wrong. I maintain that I was reasonably wrong given the available information, but I was wrong." She smiled. "I know," she said, which was the most she would say about being right about the cherries, because she was a woman who kept score but did not announce it. William had stopped between 2 of the tallest apple trees and was looking up at the branches with his head tipped back, watching the bees move through the flowers, watching the light come through the petals. He looked very small between the trees and very serious, the way children look when they are genuinely thinking something through. "He'll love this orchard," Homer said. "He already does," Annie said. William turned around and found them watching him, and he raised one arm and pointed at the trees behind him with the manner of a person who is making an announcement. "Apple," he said, which was accurate if incomplete. "Apple," Annie confirmed. "Apple." William said again with increased emphasis, having apparently decided that the first confirmation was insufficient. "All right," Homer said, with the gravity the moment required. "Apple." William seemed satisfied with this and went back to investigating. Homer and Annie stood in the warm spring morning with the orchard in bloom around them, and the creek running below, and the mountains blue in the distance. And the years that had made this moment were in it completely. The hard winters and the land disputes and the broken wagon wheel and the flat rock and the stove and the coffee and the 2 cups she kept in her coat pocket. All of it present the way the roots of the apple trees were present underground, invisible but entirely responsible for what was growing above. She had not been afraid of hard winters. He had not been afraid of hard women. They had been right about each other in the way that mattered most, not the easy right of compatible pleasantness, but the deep right of 2 people who were genuinely suited to each other's actual selves, the selves that did not change when the weather got hard, the selves that were still there at the end of a long cold season when everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and only the real thing was left. The real thing was left. It was standing in a Wyoming orchard on a spring morning with a 4-year-old between the apple trees and the mountains in the distance, and the future already planted and growing, and it was not afraid of anything. Annie reached down and took Homer's hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and William announced another apple, and the bees moved through the white flowers, and the world was exactly what it was, hard and beautiful and entirely theirs. The summer of 1883 brought the second child, a girl this time, born in late August with the same decisive efficiency as her brother but considerably more patience with the process, which Homer said was already promising. They named her Margaret Ann Ellsworth, which was Annie's idea and which Homer received with the expression he had made before, the complicated one that did not settle. Margaret for the woman he had loved before, and Anne for the woman he was loving now, and neither of them had to explain what they meant by it. Margaret Ann was a quiet baby, which astonished everyone who knew her parents and brother, but she was not passive. She simply observed with dark eyes that took in everything before she decided what she thought about it, which was a way of being in the world that everyone eventually recognized as its own kind of strength. William, at 4, regarded his sister with the cautious interest of a person who has been told good things about a new arrangement and is reserving judgment until the evidence supports the enthusiasm. By the time Margaret was 3 months old, he had clearly decided that she was acceptable, which he expressed by sitting beside her cradle and talking to her in the one-sided lecturing tone he used when explaining important things to people smaller than himself. The schoolhouse taught William his letters beginning in the autumn of 1884, and he came home from his first day of school to report that he had learned 7 letters and that Miss Farr was particular, which was the word he used for things that required careful attention and which Annie took as a compliment. Fall roundup in 1884 was the year Pete Dawson rode in one September morning with the news that he was thinking about going to Montana, where a cousin had started a ranch and was looking for experienced men. He told Homer first and then told Annie, because he understood that she was not a person you told things to second-hand if you respected her, which he did. He was 38 years old and had spent 15 years in other men's employ, and there was something in him that needed to find out if he had his own place in him somewhere. Homer shook his hand and told him he was welcome back any time, which Pete clearly understood as a real offer and not a courtesy. Annie said, "You'll do well up there. You know how to work and you know how to think, and those 2 things together are not as common as they should be." Pete had looked at her with the expression of a man who has received a compliment that he will carry for some time, and he shook her hand and rode out in the first week of October. Belle stayed. Belle would stay until there was no staying left to do, which they all understood without discussing it. He had been at the ranch going on 6 years now, and the ranch was as much his as a place can be that belongs to someone else, which is to say it was his in all the ways that mattered to a man like Belle. Collins had married a woman from Laramie in 1882 and was running his own small operation on the South Fork, doing well enough that he came to Homer occasionally for advice and to Annie occasionally for produce, which she gave him at fair prices and without condescension. The years ran on, and the orchard grew, and William grew, and Margaret Ann grew, and the ranch and the Bitter Fork land grew into a single operation of complementary parts, the cattle financing the lean years of the orchard's expansion, and the orchard providing the kind of reliable income that did not depend on the price of beef in Laramie on any given autumn, which was the kind of balance that people who have lived through enough bad seasons learn to build deliberately. In the autumn of 1885, William Hart Ellsworth, 6 years old, came home from school and reported that Miss Farr had given him a book to read that was difficult and he had read it, which he presented not as a boast but as information. Annie looked at the book. It was a history of the Western Territories, earnest and somewhat imprecise but entirely appropriate for a bright 6-year-old, and saw that he had read it, because the pages had that particular look of pages that have been read by someone who was paying attention. "What did you think?" she asked. He considered. "It doesn't say enough about the people who were already here," he said, "before the other people came." Annie was quiet for a moment because this was a true thing and a serious thing, and she wanted to respond to it correctly. "You're right," she said. "It doesn't, and that's a problem with a lot of the books that have been written about this place. The people who were here before have not had their stories told fairly or fully." "Were they treated badly?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "often very badly, and that is something that should not be forgotten or made small." He absorbed this. "Then I'll remember it," he said, with the simple completeness of a child who does not yet know the difference between deciding to remember something and actually always remembering it, but who is the kind of person who will make the attempt genuinely. He put the book on the shelf carefully and went to find his sister, and Annie stood in the room for a moment and thought about what it meant to raise children who would be honest about the world they lived in, who would not smooth over the hard parts or pretend the injustices had not happened, and she thought it was one of the most important things she could do, and she intended to do it well. She told Homer that evening, and he agreed with the same seriousness. They had seen enough of what the territory's expansion had cost the people who had been here before to understand that looking away from it was its own kind of harm, and they raised their children with the understanding that the land they worked had a history that went back further than the deed in Annie's name, and that that history mattered. The winters kept coming, as winters do, and each one was managed with the accumulated knowledge of previous winters and the additional resources that came with a ranch and an orchard that had found their stride. The blizzards were not smaller, but they were less surprising, and there is considerable power in not being surprised. In the spring of 1886, Annie's cherry trees produced their finest crop yet, and she put up 40 jars of cherry preserves that sold out of Greer's store in 2 weeks. Ida Greer, who had long since become a friend rather than just a merchant, sent word that she had orders for twice that number from 3 towns along the new rail line south, and could Annie supply them for next season. Annie sat with this question for 2 days, doing the calculation of whether the orchard's current capacity and her preserving capacity and the labor she could bring to bear made this feasible, and then she sat with Homer and they did it together. "You'd need another person for the preserving work," Homer said. "Probably 2. "There's a woman in town, Clara Hutchins's niece, who's been looking for work," Annie said. "She's capable." "Then you could do it," he said. "Yes," Annie said. "I think we could." "Hart Orchard is going to be the thing this valley is known for," he said, and it was not flattery, it was assessment, and she trusted his assessments. Ellsworth Ranch is already what this valley is known for, she said. Together we're doing all right, he said. Together we're doing better than all right, she said. He smiled at her, the full smile that she had first seen in her cabin in November of 1878 when he had carried wood through the snow, and she felt the same thing she had felt then, the current under the still water, and it had not diminished with familiarity. It had deepened, the way rivers deepen as they run longer, the way things grow more certain of themselves the more time they have to prove their own nature. Margaret Ann, at 3 years old, had decided that she wanted to help with the orchard, which she expressed by following Annie through the rows of trees and asking the names of everything with a persistence that Annie found deeply recognizable. She answered every question thoroughly, because she believed that children who ask good questions deserve complete answers. William was teaching Margaret the letters he knew, which was all of them by this point, in the particular teacherly manner of a 7-year-old who takes the responsibility seriously, and Margaret was learning them with the patient exactness of a child who does not make the mistake of appearing to understand something she does not yet understand. Bell, who was somewhere north of 60 and did not know his own age precisely, had slowed somewhat in the past year, but he was still the best fixer of things on the ranch, still the most reliable presence at the end of a long day, still the man who said exactly one more word than necessary and never one more than that. He had accumulated a relationship with William and Margaret Ann that could only be described as mutual respect across a significant age gap, conducted mostly in silence and very occasional gifts of honey. On an evening in November of 1886, Annie sat at the desk in her south-facing room, the one with the good light that had been built in the addition to the ranch house 8 years before, and she was writing in the ledger she kept for Hart Orchard, recording the season's numbers, the production and the sales and the costs and the projections forward. She was 32 years old. She had come to Wyoming at 24 with $30 and a deed and a mule named Gerald, who was now in his considerable old age and had been retired from all duties except existing, which he did with the thorough satisfaction of an animal who has earned his rest. She had built something here. Not alone, she was clear on that, clear with herself that Homer's partnership and her neighbor's goodwill and her employees' work were all part of what had made this possible. But she had been the one who had come out in the first place, and she had been the one who had stayed, and the thing that existed now was real. She heard Homer in the kitchen making tea, which he had taken up because Annie drank it in the evenings and he had discovered that he did not mind it. She heard the small sounds of the house, William asleep, Margaret Ann asleep, the fire in the main room, the particular silence of a winter evening when the world outside has settled under snow. She put down her pen and looked out the south window at the dark, where in the daylight she could see the edge of the orchard trees, bare now in the November cold, their branches like fine dark lines against whatever sky was above them. She thought about the flat rock above Bitter Fork Creek, about the spring afternoon in 1878 when she had told a man she had known for only a few months that she was not afraid of hard winters, and he had told her he was not afraid of hard women, and they had been honest with each other in a way that had determined the shape of everything that came after. She thought about how strange it was that such a large thing had come from something so simple, not a grand gesture or a dramatic event, but two people being honest with each other about what they were and what they could bear. Homer came to the doorway of the south room with 2 cups of tea. He saw her looking out the dark window with her pen down and her book closed, and he came in and set the cups on the desk and sat down in the chair beside hers. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She turned and looked at him. His face was familiar to her now in the deepest sense of familiar, not ordinary but known, the way you know something that has been tested and has not changed and will not change. "About the rock above the creek," she said. "That spring." He nodded slowly. "I think about that too sometimes." "Do you?" "I'd been trying to be careful," he said. You know that, after Margaret. I told myself I was going to be sensible about it, not rush, not let myself feel things before I was sure of them. And then, she asked, and then you sat on that rock and told me you weren't afraid of hard winters, and I thought, this is a woman who knows what she is. And I realized I'd been careful long enough. He picked up his cup, so I said what I said. It was the right thing to say, she said. I know, he said. I knew it then, which is why I said it. She picked up her own cup. The tea was good, the way everything he made was good, not elaborate, but exactly right. I'm going to expand the orchard again next spring, she said. 6 more trees on the north section. All right, he said, and I want to build a proper storage cellar specifically for the orchard, not the root cellar, a separate one, big enough to keep the crop properly. We can do that, he said. Together, she said. Together, he said. Outside, the snow was coming down again, steady and serious, the way it came every winter in this part of the Wyoming Territory, without apology and without asking whether you were ready. It came down on the ranch and the barns and the corrals and the trails and the creek below, and the orchard trees with their bare branches reaching into the dark. And it came down on everything they had built and everything they intended to build. And it was hard and cold and entirely ordinary, and they were entirely unafraid of it. They sat in the warm room and drank their tea, and outside the snow kept falling, and the fire in the main room talked to itself, and their children slept the deep sleep of children who have never had reason to doubt that they are safe. And Homer Ellsworth and Annie Hart sat side by side in the life they had made, the one that had started on a broken wagon wheel on a November road and been built from there. From honesty and stubbornness, and the willingness to feel things completely when something was worth feeling completely. The winter would be long. They had wood enough. They had each other, which was the first thing they had discovered was true, and after all the seasons that had run through since the beginning, it remained the truest thing of all.